Hi, guys. The
Hello.
first
Hey,
question I
Katie.
have for you is how are you feeling about the election slash state of the world? A, hopeless. B, hopeful. C, a combination of the two. Which is it?
I mean, I guess I would have to say C, though I'm never really hopeless. I'm more terrified than hopeless. So I definitely feel anxious about the election, anxious about the state of the world and politics. Think about it all the time. I think this is going to be an extremely close election. Even if you put the polls aside, last election was extremely close, right? Joe Biden only won by about 40,000 votes across 3 states. And the politics has become not just nastier. People used to say that like 10 years ago, just way more extreme and potentially, we saw violence on January 6th. So I do think that as a country, we're in a really bad place politically, and it makes the stakes of these elections so much higher. And that's when they're decided on a razor's edge. That makes it a tough time.
Yeah, I
Very
think
anxiety producing. How about you, Tommy?
yeah, it is very anxiety producing. I think I think we're a 50-50 country, and I am very anxious about the possibility of Trump winning again. I think on some level, the fact that it's even close is shocking and upsetting, given what we saw on January 6th. I do think, though, you said the country and the state of the world. When I look around the world, I see far-right parties doing better in places like Germany and France and other parts of Europe, in part because countries are dealing with some of the same challenges around migration and inflation and broader economic issues that we are. So there is a bit of a bad trend in the U.S. right now. In some parts of the world, that trend is not universal. Like I think we're about to see the Tory party, the Conservatives in England, get romped, and the Labour Party will likely win those elections on July 4th. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. But yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of always anxious is basically what the answer is.
You touched on why populism is on the rise worldwide. And obviously, I think you're right. It's fueled by immigration, inflation. Um, but what else is driving it? What else is driving this, pretty dramatic turn to the right in many of these countries?
I think another factor is the way the media environment has changed as well. And I think, the days, just here in the United States, right? The days of most people getting their news from a couple different sources allowed everyone to have some semblance of a shared reality, and also allowed our elected officials to communicate with wide swaths of the electorate. And so, when the president had the bully pulpit, and the bully pulpit was always an advantage. And now I think the bully pulpit just doesn't reach all that many people. And if you're a campaign and you're trying to communicate with your voters, trying to figure out where they are, how they're getting their news, what the best way to reach them is incredibly difficult. And a lot of people are getting their news from places where they're either consuming misinformation, or they're just consuming sort of a type of content that makes them cynical and distrustful of institutions.
And it
And
makes them more deeply entrenched in their point of view. As a friend of mine says, people are getting affirmation instead of information.
Hmm.
So it just makes them dig in even more.
yes, yeah,
Yeah, I also think, the classic populism is kind of we, the in group, are getting screwed by this out group. So therefore, we're going to harm the out group, and also we're going to expand social services for the people who are part of the in group. And I think that's a pretty effective recipe. But we're also seeing in places like Argentina, they recently elected a guy named Javier Milei. And he would show up. So imagine in your mind what a stunt double for a Wolverine movie looks like. And it's this guy. And he would show up to campaign events with a literal chainsaw and say, this is what I'm going to do to the system. And I think what he represents is he calls himself an anarcho-capitalist. He is basically trying to get Argentina's inflation problem under control by slashing the government in half. And what he represents, though, is a brand of politics that says the system is broken, it is irreparably damaged, it is screwing you, so let's burn it down. And I think that's the other piece of populism you're seeing.
I remember in 2012 when we were working on a couple speeches for President Obama ahead of his reelection against Mitt Romney. And we did this big speech on inequality, economic inequality. And Obama had decided that he wanted to sort of define the election around this yawning, growing gap between the rich and everyone else. And one of the arguments he made in the speech, and I hadn't really thought about it until then, is he said, economic inequality makes democracy so much harder, because if people feel like the system is not working for them, that the government is not working for them, not fighting for them, that it's only taking care of the rich and the powerful, like they're not going to have faith in the system. And that was 2012. And if we've seen everything that's happened over the last decade or so, that has only gotten more extreme.
I talked about that when I did Bill Maher's podcast and got absolutely eviscerated by the right, because I said that income inequality fuels a lot of class resentment, and that, all these uber rich people are getting richer and richer, and then you have other people who don't have $400 to pay in the event of an emergency. That creates a lot of class resentment, anti-elitism, and anti-intellectualism,
Yes.
just sort of anti-everything, honestly. And I said that, it's a terrible feeling, corrosive feeling, to feel jealous and resentful. I have felt that before. I remember being in my 20s and seeing people in my neighborhood in Atlanta driving around in nice cars. And I lived in a one-bedroom apartment, and I really thought, I'm never going to be able to afford a nice home and a nice car. And the way that made you feel, it was just like, it was resentment/anger. And anyway, the right-wing media said Trump voters were jealous and anti-intellectual. And actually, I was trying to be empathetic with people who felt like the system wasn't working for them, who had been left out of the American dream, who were in these hollowed out American cities where, the industrial aspect of where they live was kaput. So anyway,
well, and,
I don't
and
know
the entire project of the right under Donald Trump has been to seize on that resentment that you're describing and try to direct it away from, wealthy corporations and CEOs and towards sort of the cultural elite and the political elite.
And I guess that's why they were all kind of targeting me when I tried to make that point,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. And look, it's an old playbook, right? Like Nixon did this back in the early 70s, but I think it has. I think the difference is today. Also, you were talking about having that feeling when you were in your neighborhood. Well, now social media has made it so that like wealth and power and status is in everyone's face all the time. And so I think it's easier to gin up that kind of resentment in this media environment with social media than it was even, years ago.
It's so confusing because, right, I mean, we've watched over the last couple of weeks, you've seen this sort of PR effort by Elon Musk to get shareholders at Tesla to vote in favor of giving him, I think it was a $46 billion pay package.
Yes.
And he was
Crazy.
like rallying people behind this. I'm thinking to myself, like, why are people supporting this, right? Because you're right. I think I heard this morning, I can't remember the source, that savings rates were at historic lows for Americans. So people are actually, really challenged by inflation. And so Republicans, I think, are very good at identifying the problem, the unfair trade deals, the way they've harmed people, talking about income inequality. People like Trump have demagogued it. J.D. Vance is good at talking about a Republican from Ohio. But the solutions they put forward make things worse. For example, the 2017 Republican tax cut cut big pharma's taxes by more than 40%. So from 2014 to 2016, the industry paid an effective tax rate of 19.6% on average. In 2019 and 2020, it paid just 11.6%. That's what the Trump agenda gets you. A huge tax cut for big pharma. This was data according to Ron Wyden's Senate Finance Committee.
But why is there such a disconnect? Why do people think, I mean, gosh, this is what's left a lot of people scratching their heads ever since 2016. Why do people think that Donald Trump is going to make their lives better? It is confounding to me.
Yeah. What I've come to think is for a lot of voters, they don't think that either party or any politician is going to necessarily make their lives better. And so what they see in Donald Trump is someone who is just going to smash the system, and that makes them feel good, right? Because it like, well, at least he's my guy. He's gonna like fight for me where he can, and I don't necessarily expect him to help me, but he's also, as Tommy was saying, he's very good at blaming others, right? And so if Donald Trump tells you, well, you'd be making more and we'd have more jobs if we just got rid of all of these undocumented immigrants, then your life would be better. If we just cleaned up the crime and we got tough and let the police get tough on crime in these cities, your life would be better. And, unlike even Mitt Romney or the Republicans of yesteryear, Donald Trump doesn't talk a lot about giving huge tax cuts to corporations, giving huge tax cuts to the wealthy.
At least not publicly.
Not publicly, right? No, that's all in their agenda.
Fundraisers, yeah.
But they have, Trump has taught most of the Republican Party to sort of hide the economic agenda that is not very popular with most people in this country, and to really lean on sort of the cultural resentment, the racial resentment, the xenophobia that does unfortunately work with a lot of working class and middle class people of all races, by the way, in this country.
I wanted to talk to you about the media environment just because things have changed so dramatically since 19, excuse me, when I got into TV news. And now it is so fragmented, so fractured, and so partisan, right? A lot of it. But one of the things you point out in your new book called Democracy or Else, and we're going to talk about the other things in your book in a moment, sure, is that the good old days weren't that good, actually. When you had sort of three white males on an evening newscast telling the same story, basically the same way. That kept a lot of diverse voices from having a platform. It was all sort of through that patriarchal lens, honestly, because all the leadership in these newsrooms, because I worked in them, were male and white men. And so while we had a certain understanding, and I think a communal agreement of what was a fact and what wasn't, there were some drawbacks to that system. But gosh, you guys, I feel like was, having said all that, better than what we have today.
Yeah, and there was also the period, I think it was before, 1987, when the fairness doctrine was in effect, which basically said if you're going to talk about anti-abortion, the position, the pro-life position, you also had to talk about pro-choice. And I think when Reagan got rid of the fairness doctrine, it ushered in people like Rush Limbaugh, who demonstrated that partisan, conservative radio was not only an incredibly powerful political tool, but it was incredibly profitable. And then we saw Fox News, and quickly it was kind of the wild, wild west. So I think you're exactly right that, the old days, sometimes we look back at the old days with sort of this halcyon glare.
Yeah, too fondly. I hear you.
Too fondly. But, I think you're right that it was better than the kind of wild, wild west that they're seeing at the moment where, for the Biden campaign, they have to deal with basically every single day. There's some, deceptively edited video of Joe Biden going viral on a platform. But, on top of that, it's not just random users on Twitter pushing the stuff around. It's like the New York Post taking a video released by the RNC's research shop, further editing it to make it look even worse, and then posting it on their own. So it's incredibly, it's brutal out there.
I mean,
it is brutal.
The promise of like the technological advancements that gave us the internet and social media, and even more television stations, right? It's like more choice was good. More voices, especially a diversity of voices, really important, really good. Completely eliminating all gatekeepers and having so many different sources of news that we don't have no more shared sense of reality, or the idea that any single person who has a Twitter account, like their opinion now on something is going to be, just as valid as anyone else's opinion, right? Like we've just, the pendulum has swung too far.
And also, John, I think this anti-expertise, there was a book written about that, I think of maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that people no longer respect experts, which honestly, I don't understand that. Why someone would dismiss someone who studied something, understood the intricacies of the issue every which way, and yet they're not respected. I don't get that.
Yeah, well, the other thing is a lot of people then fancy themselves experts who aren't really experts, and so back to your point about sort of your own motive, affirming your own beliefs, right? So you can now always find a quote unquote expert to affirm a belief that you have about something, even if that person is not really an expert in that area, because their Twitter bio says whatever, pretends that they have a doctorate in something, and suddenly they're going on and on about, COVID and virology, and you're like, well, you've never actually studied that, but you're calling yourself a doctor in Twitter. And so it's hard for people, I think, to figure out who the real experts are and who they can trust. And that's I mean, as we saw during the pandemic, that's a real problem.
It's also it's a problem that seems sort of unique to political discourse, or at least news discussions generally. I mean, like, people will listen to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback for the New York Jets, talk about vaccines. But imagine if you walked into a room and you're about to get surgery and there's Aaron Rodgers scrubbing in. Like, I don't know that I'm not going through with that, right? I think most people are walking out. So it's a bizarre thing that we just sort of, everyone should have a voice, and I think that's wonderful. But you're right that all voices shouldn't be weighted equally.
Right. I always say the great thing about social media is that everyone has a voice. The worst thing about social media is that everyone has a voice.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your book, and then I want to ask you about some other current affairs issues right now. But why did you guys write this Democracy or Else book?
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who's worried about the country, wants to get involved in this election and hopefully future elections, but doesn't know where to begin or how to be most useful, we wrote this to basically say it's easier than you think, and it doesn't have to be terrifying. It can actually be a lot of fun. And really, it's the same thing that led us to start Pod Save America way back when, in 2017 in Crooked Media, is after Donald Trump won. We had so many people saying to us, like, what do we do? This is bad. I don't know how to get involved, or I haven't really paid attention to politics before this, and I want to help, but I don't know how. And, over the years of doing this podcast and hosting Pod Save America, and then sort of starting Vote Save America, which is sort of our organizing arm where we help people get involved in politics, and just building Crooked Media, we've learned a lot about what it takes to get involved in politics, how useful it is to be involved in politics, not just from our own experiences before this as, White House staffers and campaign staffers, but just from talking to so many smart people through Pod Save America. So this book was our attempt to put all of those lessons on paper, both from us and from a lot of the really smart people we've talked to over the years.
And also, one of the benefits of getting a little older is we realize now how lucky we were to get to work for Barack Obama on that campaign in that moment, because politics then, it felt hopeful, it felt inspiring, it felt historic, right? We were working for the first black man to become president in this country. In the last 8 years has been such a slog. It's so terrible every day and scary, and people are anxious. And we wanted to remind folks that, first of all, politics doesn't have to be zero sum. You can do a little bit or you can do a lot. It's up to you, but it all matters. But also, it can be fun. It can be hopeful. The book is very funny. There's incredibly stupid illustrations and jokes.
They're funny illustrations. They're great. And I think you're right. It's kind of it is a funny book, but about a very serious topic. And I just wonder, you guys, are you preaching to the choir? With all due respect, I mean, I love Pod Save America. I love Crooked Media. I think what you all have built is just extraordinary. And yet, who is your audience for this book?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are preaching to our choir, but what we're preaching to them is, the only way to really get out of this mess, the only way to have democracy function, is to actually go out there and persuade people and go change minds. Because we know a lot of people who are going to buy this book are already liberals or Democrats, or at least just people who don't want Donald Trump to be president. But I do think people are always looking for shortcuts. And I think in the first chapter we talk about sort of how tough our democratic system is to change, and in many ways it was built that way. And so, we'll have people say to us, well, can't we just get rid of the Senate because the Senate's not fair? Or can't we just get rid of the Electoral College? And we wanted to, in that chapter, show people how difficult it is to change the system, and where it's easier to make progress and where it's more difficult to make progress. But what it all comes down to is there is no changing the system unless we win elections. And there is no winning elections unless we all go out there and have conversations with people who do not agree with us, or who aren't sure if they're going to vote or who they're going to vote for. And we have to change their minds. And changing their minds is not, what you see happening on social media every day. It's not, politics is not about just congratulating ourselves about how right we are. Politics is about meeting other people where they are and sort of trying to bring them along by changing their minds, or at least doing our best to change their minds.
It's hard. I mean, I want to talk about the persuadables because I think there is this wide swath of the American electorate who aren't on the extremes. I'm sure you read Jonathan Haidt's article in The Atlantic about why the last 10 years have been uniquely stupid. And it's really about the loudest voices that are dominating social media that I think give people a complete misrepresentation of the way people are feeling about a whole variety of issues. But I was with somebody, I did a breast cancer walk, and a very nice woman was walking, and she said, I think we probably disagree politically, but I really appreciate your cancer advocacy work. And I said, thank you so much. And I'm curious, why you feel strongly about supporting, who you're supporting. I tried to kind of keep it friendly and nice. And I said, because, it really upsets me that people insist the election was rigged. And 62, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, 62 courts have dismissed cases that have alleged that. And if there was real evidence beyond sort of the typical, screw ups that happen that don't necessarily affect the outcome, don't you think our judicial system would have, dealt with that? And she said, well, I don't trust. Oh, I saw videos of women stuffing ballot boxes. I said, I don't think those were necessarily accurate. Well, I don't really trust the judicial system. And, so where do you go from there? It's very hard, but I think that individual was in a group that would not be considered part of the persuadables, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the Democratic side of this debate has a harder job because we believe in institutions, while Republicans are able to sow distrust in those institutions, and it helps their argument that, for example, the 2020 election was stolen. So there's a really long, difficult challenge ahead of all of us of restoring people's faith in politics, restoring people's faith in institutions. And part of that is going to be delivering on the big challenges that people are pissed about. And so, the Affordable Care Act did an enormous amount of good. 40 million people have health care because of it, but costs are still way too high, and it didn't help everybody. So it's a long game. But, the other thing I think we've learned over many years in politics, Katie, is that voters are really weird. When you talk to voters, they do not line up on traditional lines that you hear about in the press. I watched, there was a vote. Remember the uncommitted vote in Michigan where in the Democratic primary, you had a bunch of people voting uncommitted instead of for Joe Biden to protest his Gaza vote? I watched a focus group of, I think, 8 or 10 Democrats who voted uncommitted. And one of the people in this focus group said she voted uncommitted because Joe Biden hadn't done enough to help Israel. And I thought to myself, you did not get the assignment. This is, but it's right. Voters are weird. Quirky opinions and different things drive them, and you can be poisoned by bad information, but have good intentions.
Well, and to that point, I think if you're sitting down with someone and you were trying to convince them, you don't start by you don't start by bringing up the 2020 election and trying to argue them out of their belief that it was stolen.
Right.
I don't know necessarily that would get you that far, but you could say, okay, what do you care about? What are you worried about right now? What issues are top of mind for you? And I think we have a story in the book about this organizer in Pennsylvania. Her name was Angela Aldis, and she was in Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania, and it's very conservative, and she's very liberal, and this was in 2018, and she started knocking on doors, and it was a lot of Trump voters, and one woman opened the door, and she was a Trump voter too, and instead of trying to like yell at her about politics, she was like, well, what are you worried about? You know, what do you care about? And she's like, well, I'm really upset about the high cost of my prescriptions. And Angela was like, well, you know, I have MS, and like I've had that worry too. And they both start talking about the drug companies and prescription, stuff like that. And they started coming to this understanding about how like politicians need to do a better job of making sure that healthcare is cheaper and more people have access to it. And the Trump supporter might not have known necessarily that that was a more liberal democratic position, but they had this good conversation about it, and that moved her closer to the direction that Angela wanted to go in. And like, did she?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that was a really stupid way for me to broach the topic, but we were also on a 3.2-mile walk, and I didn't have that much time.
Well, look, when someone brings it up to you, it's not like you can be like, like you're gonna end up talking about it, you know.
But I think you're right. Like, tell me what you're worried about. Tell me what issue you care about and how you're feeling about your situation. I think you're right. That's a much better way. And, you know, one of the things you all point out in your book is that we're not as polarized as we think we are. You had some statistics, and I think you have some statistics in the book, and I think they bear repeating. In 1996, 27% of people supported gay marriage. In 2023, 71%. 59% opposed the overturning of Roe v. Wade. 80% opposed a federal abortion ban. A Fox News poll found that 80% of people favor background checks on gun purchases, making 21 the minimum age to purchase a gun. Yes, and I remember I did a documentary on gun violence and reducing gun violence, and I think it was 74% of NRA members favor stricter gun laws. So why is it so hard to address these issues and to bring people who are in the middle, center left or center right, and form a coalition of these people?
I mean, I think at the moment, the challenge on gun rights, for example, or gun control is, you have the numbers you just read, which just shows overwhelming majorities in this country want more sensible gun control policies in place. And then we have a Supreme Court that just voted against a very limited effort by Donald Trump to ban a tool that turns semi-automatic rifles into machine guns. You know what I mean? And so the disconnect between what people want and what our judges or elected officials are willing to let happen is just yawning. And so what that does is it makes people on the left who are fighting for sensible gun laws, they feel demoralized and depressed, and they stop trying. And you have people on the right who are insulated from, or Republicans are insulated from these policies. So I mean, this is part of the broader challenge that Democrats face, which is we are not delivering on the things people care about, in large part, in this case, because of the Republicans. And Republicans are able to harness that cynicism to keep voters at home.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in the Obama administration when we tried to pass background checks, and the two senators that ended up coming up with a compromise on background checks were Joe Manchin, no one's idea of a liberal,
yeah.
and Pat Toomey, conservative senator
Right.
from Pennsylvania, and they come up with this compromise on background checks, and the Republicans in Congress still voted down. They still blocked it. And I remember Obama at the time thinking, like, if we can't pass this after the tragedies and the mass shootings that we have seen, and that was back then, and we can't pass a common sense, extremely popular proposal that has been put forth by a conservative Republican senator and a very conservative Democrat from West Virginia, like, I don't know how we're going to get this done. But a lot of voters aren't paying attention to everything that happens in Washington and all the machinations. So for people who really want something done on guns, what do they think? They think, oh, Washington failed again, and both parties couldn't figure it out, even though it was a bipartisan compromise, right? Both parties couldn't figure it out, and Obama couldn't get it done, and so I'm not going to vote on that issue because no one's going to get it done.
I mean, you have you have voters in polls today who blame Joe Biden for Roe versus Wade being overturned, right? So
right, yeah.
A lot of folks just aren't paying attention. They don't really know what's happening. They just know they're pissed at the outcome.
Gosh, I mean, there are a couple of things that come to mind with that. I mean, why are people so ignorant about some of this stuff? Is it because we no longer teach civics? Is it because the information they're getting is so twisted and manipulated and full of falsehoods that people don't know what's up, which way is up, and what is real?
I mean, I think it's a couple things, and I think it's sort of a vicious cycle that it reinforces itself, which is people are busy. It's not everyone's job to pay close attention to politics. People are not political junkies like we are, and they're working very hard at their jobs to raise their families, and so they don't have a lot of time to pay attention. And then when they do pay attention, when they do tune into politics, what do they see on television? Well, they see people yelling at each other. They see talking heads going back and forth. They see like a bunch of polling. They see misinformation on social media. They don't know who to believe. And so they're like, I don't know. I'm out. Like, I don't need to pay attention to this. I don't know what to believe anymore. It all seems like noise to me. So I'm just gonna live my life, and that's that. So I do think that's why I don't think it's necessary that people like are willfully ignorant. And I think people, that's one of the challenges, right? You hear a lot of people in politics say, oh, voters are stupid, or they should know that Trump is bad, or it's like, you know what? It's everyone's job to fulfill the obligations of citizenship, but it's not everyone's job to like sort through just the reams of information out there and news sources and figure out what's true and what's not.
So how do you fix it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that one thing you're going to see in this election is, and when you talk to organizers and campaign staffers, there's a big emphasis now on something called relational organizing, where you are not just calling strangers and knocking on strangers' doors, but you're really reaching out to all the people in your social network and trying to persuade them, or people in your neighborhood, people you get to know. And then you have these conversations, and this is known as deep canvassing, where the conversations we were just talking about, where you don't just show up at someone's door with a script given to you by a campaign. You kind of have like a 15, 20-minute conversation about what do you care about, what issues are on your mind. And because voters don't have as much trust in institutions, whether they be campaigns, the media, government, they do have trust in the people that they know. And so those people, the people that they know, end up being the most trusted and persuasive messengers, or people that you can have a conversation with, that you can see face to face. So I do think one side effect of the media environment becoming so fractured and polarized is that people are going back to these face-to-face conversations with people in their local community. And I do think that's where, like, if we're going to fix politics, it has to start there.
I mean, I think John's right on sort of like the big picture need. I mean, just to slice it a little narrower, like, you asked about sort of why, people are not well informed, or why they're turned off by politics. And, it's often the case that people tune in to a campaign at big moments, like a debate. And let's just be honest, like, those big moments have gotten terrible. I was reading a report today by a group of researchers at Princeton that analyzed all the debates from 2004 until today. God bless those poor bastards who had to watch all of these. They found that the crosstalk of debates, just candidates yelling over each other, it jumped from one instance in the first Bush versus Kerry debate in 2004 to 76 instances in the first Biden versus Trump debate in 2020. If you don't care about politics and you're turning on that debate trying to be like, oh, who am I going to vote for? And that disaster is what you see, you're turning the channel. You're going to ESPN and you're like, I'm not voting.
It's so true. It's such a shit show, which brings me to the upcoming debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Are you terrified? Are you anxious about that? I know they're going to turn off the mics. They're going to set into motion certain things that will hopefully keep it more civil. But what do you guys think?
Yeah, completely terrified.
Completely terrified. Yeah, and listen, we went to.
I don't know how you can. I don't know how you wouldn't be.
It's a big deal.
Well, what does that say about the Democratic presidential candidate if you're so terrified?
I mean, listen, we just saw President Biden at an event out here in Los Angeles, and he had just made 2 trips to Europe in the last, in less than a week. And candidly, he looked exhausted. And it was a little bit dispiriting to walk out of there and be like, oh boy, there's not a lot of pep in his step. He wasn't there wasn't a clear message coming out of that event. Now it was a fundraiser. It's fine. People weren't there to be persuaded. They were there because they gave money. But, he needs to be on his game, and he needs a moment in this debate like he had at the State of the Union, where he came out feisty and was going back and forth with Republicans and making a point. And so he needs to be sharp and on his game in that sense. And then from a messaging perspective, Joe Biden needs to be painting a picture of what he would do with 4 more years, and explaining to people that he understands that he got a lot done, but he understands that they're so frustrated, and he hears them, and this is how he's going to work on it. And this is why Donald Trump would not actually help the things that they're worried about, because this is a man who only cares about himself, his rich friends, his donors, and keeping his ass out of prison.
Yeah, I mean,
John?
I think Joe Biden is a good, decent human being. I think he's been a great president. I don't think he's ever been an excellent communicator. And I think that as he's aged, I think his mental acuity is sharp, and I've known that from just personal experiences with him and following him. But I think the one thing that age has done is it's sort of softened his voice, right? He's shuffling a little more because of he's got some back issues. And you can sit there and argue with the media about showing this clip or that clip, but this is how he's going to come off to people. And like Tommy said, there are these moments where he has appeared very energetic and feisty, and he needs to show that at the debate. But also, I think the more important thing for all of us is Joe Biden has made the decision that Joe Biden is running again, right? That was Joe Biden's decision, and that's where we are. And for the rest,
I know, but can I interrupt you
Sure.
and ask you,
Yeah.
were you disappointed that he wanted to run again, and that he, at 81, when he said during the campaign in 2020 he was going to be the bridge to a new generation of leadership with Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Gretchen Whitmer at his side, that the bridge was 8 years instead of 4?
it turned out to be a longer bridge.
Turned out to be the Bay Bridge.
Infrastructure bill, yeah.
I've tried to put myself in Joe Biden's shoes making that decision. And I do think that he looked around at the rest of the field, he looked around at the other possible candidates, and said to himself, I think I am better positioned to beat Donald Trump, because I did once before, than any of these other politicians who have not been tested nationally and who have not been under the tough spotlight of a national campaign. And if I step aside and say, okay, let's have an open primary now, and one of these people wins the primary and then loses to Donald Trump, and I think that I could have done a better job. I think it was a tough call. It would have been a tough call for me.
Conversely, though, what if he loses to Donald Trump, and there goes his legacy?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, and I think he is. I'm sure he has weighed that as well. And it's just where I've ended up is that's all his decision, and the rest of us need to figure out how to tell voters that, yes, he appears older, and maybe he's not the best communicator, but he's been a damn good president. He has fought really hard for regular Americans and not just the wealthy or people who are extremely loyal to him, like Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is a threat to the country, is a threat to democracy. Forget about just Democrats. It's a threat to our ability to make decisions about who governs us. And so whatever your qualms about Joe Biden, whatever your disappointments, we cannot go down the road of another Trump presidency, because it will be much more extreme and worse than the first.
I also think every president in history has had a gigantic ego. All of them do.
Yeah.
To the point where they not only, it's not enough to be president, they compete with each other to see who is the greatest president. I think every president thinks that to be a great president, you need 2 terms. So there's clearly, a lot of ego involved, and, it could turn out to be a profoundly damaging decision the way you described if somehow this ushers in a second Trump agenda. On a personal level, I'm incredibly frustrated that we are constantly having to talk about the age of our Democratic nominee in this campaign. That's the last thing I think I want to be talking about. The flip side of that, though, is he's got an incredible record to run on. And we should all just be honest that an open primary ahead of this campaign would have been a messy disaster. It just always is. Every primary process is lots of infighting. The party gets driven left on a bunch of issues. You never know what's going to come of it. So, either path would have had a lot of challenges to it. And so, to Jon's point, it's like, here we are. We got to just forge ahead and win.
Yeah.
Why hasn't the Biden administration been more effective at communicating his accomplishments? It doesn't seem as if, and is this part of the messy media landscape playing into this, but it doesn't seem as if people understand or appreciate what the Biden administration has done, nor do they really understand why he wants to be president and what he hopes to accomplish in the next 4 years. I read stuff all the time, and I have to say, I don't have a clear understanding of either of those things.
I think that I think they've spent too much time worrying about selling or defending their accomplishments. I think we could have told them, having gone through the Obama administration experience, that it's just tough. Passing the CHIPS Act, this enormous investment in semiconductor development in the U.S. so that we're not dependent on Taiwan in case they're invaded by China. Enormous accomplishment, a huge deal. But let's be honest, it's sort of an esoteric conversation. It's also a one-day story. Congrats, you passed the bill. 6 months later, a year later, you can talk about opening a new factory in some swing state and how it's going to create jobs. So they're doing their best to kind of continue to press the case on this story
and
over time.
Connect the dots, right, to voters.
Connect the dots for people. But day to day, if I'm a single parent and I go to the gas station and it costs me $25 more to fill up my tank every single time, do I care about semiconductor manufacturing? No. I'm just pissed.
Or do you care when someone at the White House is like, "Oh, I know you're annoyed about your gas, but did you know that gas prices have just fallen 4 months in a row?"
Right.
So Joe Biden, right? So it's like there's this weird, I do think it's important to talk about what he's accomplished, and you can see this in focus groups too. For an episode of The Wilderness I was doing, I was talking to some folks who were doing a lot of focus groups with undecided black voters. And it turns out in a lot of those focus groups, when you do talk about what Joe Biden has done and accomplished, they're like, "Oh, I didn't realize that. That's good to know," right? That's a good piece of information. But politics forever has been like, what have you done for me lately, and how have you improved my life? And right now people are worried about the cost of living. The biggest the biggest cost of living is where you live, whether it's mortgage or rent. That's very high. It is very hard. Joe Biden has not it's hard to do something about that on the national level, right? Housing is an issue that's local, state, federal. I think he has a plan now to give a big tax credit for people who are buying new homes, but also the interest rates are beyond his control. He has to wait to see what the Fed does.
What about some of those kitchen table issues, you guys? Like the price of a thing of yogurt. I mean, it's insane when you go to the grocery store, or the price of gas or rent. Did they not talk about that soon enough? It felt like they were crowing about the economy while so many people were hurting. Would you have advised them to say, "Hey, at least talk about it, empathize with people, feel their pain like Bill Clinton did, and kind of get the issue front and center"? I feel like they didn't embrace it soon enough. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. Look, and we're speaking from experience here. We went through this as well, right? Like Barack Obama in 2010, and we got smoked in the midterms in 2010.
Right. I remember.
And that was one of the main criticisms. And again, it was this constant tension in our White House. Barack Obama just passed the Recovery Act. He's doing all this stuff. People don't know about it. We got to talk about it more. And then I always, remember Axelrod was always in our head when we were writing speeches being like, you've got to feel sympathy for people who are still struggling. And we've got to make sure that we lead with that. And look, I think that the Biden campaign has now made that turn, which I think is important. The inflation report came out the other week, and it showed inflation was down. And instead of just like boasting about it, their statement was, we realize that prices are still too high, and Joe Biden is going to fight to keep costs down with this, and the Republicans are not. Like Donald Trump's plan is going to make inflation skyrocket, and prices are going to end up being higher if Donald Trump wins. So I do think in the debate you'll see, I hope, Biden try to focus people more on the choice between what Trump would do for cost of living and what he would do for cost of living if you give him another 4 years.
Yeah, it's also, you're always fighting the last battle in these jobs. And, it's a lot, most people believe that our recovery during the Obama administration from the financial crisis would have been faster and stronger if we had done a larger stimulus bill. So the Biden team chose, after this once in a lifetime, pandemic, to run the economy a little hot, to try to put forward a bigger stimulus. And that clearly led to some inflation. Now, at the end of the day, we have recovered from the pandemic better than any country in the world. And inflation is coming down faster, but it's just really hard to sell to people, hey, you know what, it could have been a lot worse. Like, that's just, it never plays.
Counterfactual is tough. Yeah.
Real quickly, I could talk to you guys all day, but I promise I am not going to. I wanted to ask you about the conviction that we recently saw on 34 counts in New York, and juxtapose that with Hunter Biden's conviction. Obviously, we know they're very different cases, and yet they're being manipulated. And I'm curious how you think both of those will play out, in addition to these other cases that seem as if they're not going to happen for quite a while, and maybe not until after the election, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Trump conviction will be a data point for voters who are making up their minds. And, you've already seen a little movement in the poll on this. And then, there's plenty of interviews. I think the New York Times went back and did a great, they had previously done a poll. They went back to the respondents, asked them about it. They had some good interviews. And, you hear some people say, like, you know what, I was undecided before. I can't be voting for a convicted felon. I can't do it. So you will have some of those people. You'll have a lot of people who are like, either I wasn't going to vote for Donald Trump ever before this conviction, and so I'm not going to now either. And then you have other people who are like, I like Donald Trump. I think it was bullshit. And I'm not going to change my mind, right? So I think it has an effect on the margins, but of course this is a race that's going to be decided on the margins. And so it could have an impact. I don't think that the Hunter Biden verdict will have an impact, not necessarily because of the charges in the trial itself, but because I do think voters understand that he's not running for president. Joe Biden is, and there is no connection to Joe Biden. And so, look, I think if Joe Biden loses the election, it's going to be more because some of these other issues we talked about, people's concerns about cost of living and is he taking enough action and all the stuff that usually hurts incumbent presidents. But I don't think it will be the Hunter thing.
The most hopeful data I've heard about Trump's conviction was, I forget which poll it was, but it found that 1 in 5 independent voters both felt strongly about the conviction. It was that 1 in 5 independent voters said it was less likely to make them vote for Donald Trump, and that the conviction mattered a lot to their decision. So for the persuadable universe out there is a lot smaller than we want it to be, but it did seem like a significant number of independent voters actually did care, and that this would inform their vote.
Yeah.
So let's wrap things up where we kind of started, which is your book that you have displayed prominently on Democracy or Else, which is really a call to arms for people who care about democracy and want to make sure that it continues in this country. If you had to summarize, obviously the first thing people should do is buy your book, but if you had to summarize some of the key points that you all outline in this, what would they be? Jon, why don't you start, and then Tommy, you can add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that getting involved in politics It does not have to be as confusing or scary or pointless as it may seem, and that there are a ton of different ways to get involved. And sort of the way we laid out all the chapters is it can be as simple as getting informed so you know who you're voting for and what you're voting on. And then if you feel like you want to do more than that, you can donate, then you can volunteer, then you could be an organizer, you could get a job in politics, which is what we did, and it was very fulfilling. You could hopefully run for office yourself. And so there's a whole bunch of different ways to get involved. And the more you're involved in politics, even when you lose, it still feels like you're having more of an impact when you're out there talking to people, persuading people, working in your community, paying attention, than just watching this whole thing unfold on your screen. Because that's when you're most likely to feel helpless, when you're just a spectator. And when you actually get into the ring and get involved, even when you lose, and you will have setbacks and you'll have disappointments, you're still going to feel this sense of agency, that you have some control over what's happening with this country. And it's a lot of fun. And you get to meet people who, are going to end up being your best friends for life.
I think in the book, we sort of walk you through a ladder of engagement from the easiest things to do, like just get better news, to I think the book ends with our reader being a disgraced one-term president.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
So we will baby step you up to the top. But I mean, I think just the one thing I want, John made a great plug for the book, so I'm not even going to do it. I just want folks to know, getting involved in politics doesn't mean fighting it out over Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. It could mean going to a community meeting in your town and changing the way schools are run, yep. Or, like getting involved locally. And that's where you can have just an enormous impact. I mean, if you decide to work full time on a state Senate campaign, you can do so much good and change the way that race goes just by being there, just by donating $10 and just by being a part of it. So it will be fun. It will be rewarding. It really does matter.
I wanted to knock on doors in Pennsylvania just to encourage people to vote. Because even though in 2020, 67% of people, eligible voters, did vote, it's still sort of a sad number, and it's usually much, much lower than that. Mm-hmm. Why can't we make Election Day a national holiday?
We should.
Yeah,
we should.
We should. That would help. I mean, there's a whole bunch of steps we can take to make voting easier for more people. And some states have already done it. Like there are states now that are sending everyone a ballot, right? Which is great.
We vote by mail in California. Comes to your house, you fill it out, and you send it in.
It's very easy here. So I do think there's things we can do to make voting easier. And look,
do you think some of those things, though, to make voting easier, makes people? Do you think some of those things that perhaps make voting easier result in more skepticism about the fairness of elections? It always seems to be a challenge, kind of a push-pull there.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it did in 2020. I don't think it did before that. I mean, Republicans were huge fans of vote by mail, especially in Florida, where Donald Trump lived and voted by mail, by the way, for a very long time. And then suddenly when Democrats tried to make it easier for people to vote because, they didn't want to die in a pandemic, they demagogued it, and it's become this big, big fight. But I think you're seeing all these reports now that Republicans are asking Trump to walk back some of his criticism of vote by mail and early voting because they want their voters to do it too.
Well, and also, if the polls are to be believed this time around, some of the low propensity voters, the voters who don't turn out in every election, Trump is doing a lot better with than Biden. And so if you have a very high turnout election, it might actually be better for Trump than it is for Biden. And usually that's been flipped. The Democrats always wanted a high turnout and Republicans did not. But look, if you believe in democracy, then you want to expand the right to vote and make sure everyone's voting. And even if it means that your side might not do as well. So who knows? Maybe if the Republicans suddenly find out that more people voting helps them, they'll sign on to some of these reforms that actually make it easier to vote for people.
If you were betting men, who would you say is going to win in November, guys?
Oh,
John? God.
I got to say Biden. But it's honestly, it's like... it's the closest thing to 50-50 that there is. And like I said, that's just forget about all the polls. It's the same two guys that ran last time, and it was 40,000. They were 40,000 votes apart last time. So it's a coin toss.
Tommy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just saw the 538 does kind of a national average, and I think it's currently Biden's 40.6% and Trump's at 40.4%. So the polls are as
Good
close
Lord.
to tied as they could be, and then RFK Jr.'s got 9%. So I don't know. I'm going to bet on Biden because I have to bet with my heart and not my head, but it's 50-50.
Well, Jon Favreau and Tommy Vietor, the book is called Democracy or Else: How to Save America in 10 Easy Steps. I thought it said baby steps. It says easy
That too.
steps.
That too.
From the hosts of Pod Save America. You guys, thank you so much. As I said, I could talk to you for hours about all this stuff, and hopefully we can talk again, either on your podcast or mine.
Please.
Same here. It's always a pleasure to
Yeah.
talk to you, Katie.
Thank you.